check with the clerk. I think we can actually begin, and then we just would wait to take an action until we have our quorum. So I think we'll go ahead and do that, knowing that we may lose our quorum at 2:30. So I'll gavel us in here and call into order our regularly scheduled meeting of the Intergovernmental Relations Committee. My name is Elizabeth Glidden. I'm the chair of this committee. And we are joined today by council members Alondra Cano and Andrew Johnson, and we are waiting for one more, so we have a quorum to do business. We have 2 items on our consent agenda, so I will move those forward first. The first item is referring to staff an ordinance amending Title II, Chapter 19 of the Minneapolis Code of Ordinances relating to administration, employee authority, and immigration matters, clarifying policy intent and adding further provisions related to administration. Again, that's just a referral to staff. Second item on our agenda is a contract with Lockridge Grindle Nowen for federal representation services. And this includes filing and receiving our ethics officer report related to conflict of interest, and then authorizing a contract not to exceed $100,000 with Lockridge Grindle Nowen for federal representation. So I will move both those items, see if anyone wants to take any item off for further discussion. Oops, and we will wait to do those items after we have our quorum. So our third item then is our discussion item. We have three discussion items. The first is, I think, a shorter discussion item, and I'm not sure who is doing the presentation on that. Okay. Ms. Lesh, we are on item 3, which is 2017 City Policy Positions and Legislative Agenda, adding language relating to gun violence prevention and responsible gun ownership.
Thank you, Madam Chair and Council members. Good afternoon. As Madam Chair noted, we are proposing to add 2 new items to the city's 2017 policy positions, not to the legislative agenda, but just to the policy positions. And I can read the text of both of the items. We currently have a section in our policy positions that identifies proactive gun violence prevention measures that we would suggest be passed into law to further gun violence prevention. We do not, however, have any items that list the legislative proposals that the city would oppose and have concerns with. So that's what you see listed here. So the first item that we would add would state, the city of Minneapolis opposes legislation that undermines common sense gun violence prevention initiatives and would make our communities less safe, including so-called, quote, permitless carry legislation, allowing people to carry concealed loaded guns in public without a permit or safety training. Item number 1, and item number 2 is, quote, stand your ground legislation, which expands circumstances in which people are allowed to use deadly force, eliminates the duty to de-escalate, and creates legal hurdles that make it harder to hold shooters accountable. Madam Chair, we would suggest these be added to the 2017 policy positions.
All right, thank you for that. I'll ask my colleagues if they have any questions about those items. I'm not seeing any, so thank you very much for the presentation, and we'll move on to item number 4, which is the 2018 proposed federal budget presentation. And Mr. Ebnett. I don't know if Mr. Ranieri wanted to give any introduction.
Yes, I'm going to do the introduction. My name is Gene Ranieri. I'm the Director of Government Relations for the City of Minneapolis. We're going to talk today, Mr. Ebnett and Mr. Bauer, about the federal budget process, something we really don't spend a lot of time on. So we're going to go over how it's organized, talk about the president's so-called skinny budget or blueprint, which came out a couple of weeks ago and had some significant cuts, talk about that, how it impacts the city, and then try and maybe do a little bit of foretelling the future, what will happen in April when Congress needs to do either a continuation of a continuing resolution or adopt a new budget for 2017. Because what we have now is a 2017 calendar federal fiscal year, which ends in September, but it's only funded through April. And it's funded by a continuing resolution, which basically says it's the prior year's budget and maybe inflated a little bit. And what is in abeyance is what happens for the rest of the year to September. And our staff will talk about that, and we can get into a discussion. So I'll turn it over to Peter and Matt.
Madam Chair, committee members, The purpose of today's presentation is to provide a summary of the presidential budget that was released on March 16th, highlight agency programs and the budgets that were of particular interest to the city, identify any local implications for the budget, and finally provide comment on the prospects for the budget and what to watch for in the near future. The following is a general outline of the federal budget process. So the president submits a budget to Congress. The House and Senate then pass budget resolutions, and those resolutions then are adopted. The House and Senate appropriations subcommittees develop bills based on those. The House and Senate then vote on those appropriation bills, and it's up to the president then to sign one of those bills. If there's no appropriations signed by the start of the fiscal year, which is October 1st, then agencies operate under a continuing resolution.
And Mr. Ebnett, maybe you just want to refresh us. Do we just need a simple majority for Congress to vote on the appropriations measures?
Sure. So we'll talk about it in a little bit,
Okay.
but there are some circumstances where you'll need more of a majority. So just some key dates. On the 16th, President Trump presented his budget. As Jean mentioned, April 28th, the temporary continuing resolution bill expires. And if there isn't something done before that time, it would lead to a partial government shutdown. In May, the president will reveal the remainder of his budget. And then in summer and fall, Congress will try to advance spending bills for the fiscal year 2018. And that begins on October 1st. So what was included in the president's budget? The proposal adds $54 billion to defense budget caps and reduces non-defense budget caps by the same amount. Those caps were set in the Budget Control Act of 2011, what people commonly refer to as the sequestration. It increases funding for the Department of Defense, Homeland Security, and Veterans Affairs, and there are deep cuts to several other agencies. At least 80 programs and offices or agencies are slated for elimination, and it would result in a 1.2% cut to discretionary spending overall. The proposal increases base defense funding by $25 billion and reduces non-defense programs by $15 billion. This is offset by $18 billion in undetermined non-defense discretionary funds. Here again, it's important to mention that we don't know the specifics of a lot of these proposals, and that those will be included in the final budget, likely released in May. Here's a graphic showing the fiscal year 2017 and 2018 levels, and those are compared to the proposed budget. So you see defense has increased significantly and non-defense has decreased. Under the Budget Control Act of 2011, which established the annual sequester cap, the defense spending should be reduced by about $2 billion from last year's spending levels, and non-defense discretionary funds should be decreased by about $3 billion. The president's budget as proposed to date, though, only discusses defense domestic discretionary pieces of the federal budget. It doesn't address any of the mandatory entitlement programs or how the government revenues are to work to balance these different pieces of the budget. So as you can see in this graphic, this means we only have information on 27% of the overall budget. So some things that aren't included in the budget. Specific program level details for discretionary spending, with the exception of some of the highlighted programs in the budget. Any discussion of income tax change proposals is not included. Potential changes to mandatory programs such as Medicare, Medicaid. Specifics about potential changes to the Affordable Care Act. And this is especially uncertain after the recent unsuccessful attempt to replace the ACA. And then also infrastructure financing, which is a big part of President Trump's campaign. There's no indication about how that will work. This means that we could see even further cuts to discretionary accounts to make up for any non-budget neutral proposals for the other 3/4 of the budget. With that, I'll turn the presentation over to Matt Bauer to walk you through the proposed budget's impact on federal agencies and the potential impact to the city.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, to the details of the budget proposal, this chart illustrates the top line budget lines for each of the federal agencies. Cuts range from 31 to 1% of individual agency budgets, with most cuts in the 13 to 20% range. Two agencies are proposed for increases of single digits, and a third, defense, as noted earlier, is slated to get a 10% increase in their budget due to the increase in its particular sequester cap. These agencies in bold on the screen are ones that the city receives annual recurrent funding for, and we'll cover these in a little more detail in the following slides. But we should note that the only information we have at this point is what is included in the President's very thin budget proposal issued the other week, and so we don't know any more beyond that. There's some details leaking out, but again, those are just details that aren't confirmed, and so we expect to see in the President's May budget release further details on each of these individual agencies.
So, Mr. Bauer, before you continue, I want to make sure that we're understanding first some of the terms that you're using. So you've highlighted and starred these departments where you say we have annual recurrent funding. So can you say a little bit more about what that is? Does that mean we have a grant that goes for multiple years, or is this all kind of formula funding or other things that go directly to cities? So just a little bit more, please.
Correct. We'll highlight some of the types of programs that these agencies fund in the city. But these are ones where we either receive a formula amount, such in the case of HUD, the Housing and Urban Development Department, or we receive pass-through funds from the state, which qualifies for a formula, such as the labor grants from the Department of Labor, so workforce training grants. And then there are some health and human service programs where the city receives both competitive funding, but also some pass-through funding from the state and county as well, that who would apply to the federal.
So the reason I'm asking is that if you could go back again, please. Looking at this list, I just want to make sure kind of my understanding is right, that there may be other departments on this list or maybe other sections of funding where maybe it's not formula or pass-through formula that goes to the state, but that over the years, kind of more often than not, we have utilized various grants, competitive grants, or other kinds of things that have been, in the end, been important to the city. So, as an example, I don't know where the National Endowment of the Arts falls under this, because you have bigger categories here, but as an example, those are competitive grants, but the city has to have a process because you have to have a city partner to receive those grants. And over the years, we have had several grants that ended up, influencing the kind of the makeup and culture in the city.
Madam Chair and members of the committee, some of the further slides, we do talk about some of these programs and the partners that maybe not the city isn't affected, but some of our key partners in the community are affected, and that we work with them in the delivery of these initiatives. The Department of Labor is slated for a 21% cut. Specifically, the budget indicated that some low-performing Job Corps centers would be slated for closure. We would expect that the 21% cut would affect Workforce Opportunity Investment Act funding that comes through the state to the city CPED department. And these job training grants annually are around $2 million to the city. We would expect reductions into those with this type of budget, even though that particular program hasn't been slated for either spelled out for a reduction or elimination, but we'll probably find out the level of reduction hopefully in May. The Justice Department is slated for a 20% cut in its programming. Again, details are limited, but we see in the language that they have discussed where local law enforcement efforts are supported with Department of Justice funding, that those will probably be reduced or curtailed. And any funding, there is funding increased for border enforcement, immigration courts, and the FBI in this budget. And again, Minneapolis, we receive around $1 million annually from Department of Justice programming, mostly through competitive grant awards.
So could you give us a little bit more of an understanding of what types of programs have been funded through Justice? So I believe some programming that supports a variety of efforts around domestic abuse prevention work, but I'm not sure if other sort of grants that go to support police departments. I think we've gotten, is it a COPS grant or things like that? I don't know if that's through Justice or somewhere else. And then I know we've also had different support that has come to the fire department, and I'm unclear where that comes from. So this is kind of a whole, enterprise of public safety supports. I want to make sure I'm understanding.
Madam Chair, the police department has received Justice funding to assist with equipment purchases, staff overtime. The attorney's office has received Justice funding for the domestic abuse work that they do. It supports, I believe, 2 attorneys that currently. We also have received recently the funding for the body cams in the police department. That was through the Justice funding. And I believe that is the primary uses of the money here locally. And fire department gets money from Homeland Security, and we'll get into that in a couple slides here.
Okay.
Health and Human Services, this department, again, we don't have a lot of details, but there are 2 programs that have been slated for elimination in the president's budget that are key funding components for our community partners, such as community action agencies. And this would be the Low Income Home Energy Assistance Program and the Community Services Block Grant, which is social services block grant. The philosophy that's come through the budget in the language in the budget is a lot of these are local priorities, and so the local community is expected to pick up funding for these type of things. And so, in the case of the home heating assistance that's funded through the Energy Assistance Program, if that's an issue locally for a local community, then the federal government through this budget is expecting that local community will step up to the plate and fund that type of work. We do have direct funding awards for 2 programs that are slated for a reduction in the budget, and that is the Healthy Start program and Maternal, Infant, and Early Childhood programming. And annually, we receive about $1.5 million for that locally. We also receive temporary assistance for needy families funding, TANF, which is a pass-through fund through the county in the state. And we pass that through to the community. That's in the mandatory piece of the budget, that other 73% that Peter highlighted earlier. We have no idea. We can guess, but we have no idea what the priority for that type of funding is. We would expect, based on the rest of the budget, we could expect that that's going to be slated for severe cuts, but we don't know to what extent. Department of Transportation, there's 2 things we want to highlight that's been identified in the president's budget. One is the elimination of Tiger grants. This is a program a competitive program that the city's taken advantage or has applied for, and other local partners have taken advantage of as well. And it's for funding multimodal transportation projects. And then also it's identified that the Federal Transit Administration's New Starts program would only continue for those with full funding grant agreements in place. And right now, the Blue Line extension and Southwest LRT is in some stage of that process, and we are not clear on whether they would be covered by this, by being included or not. But these are all these three transit projects that are scheduled to come online in the future potentially could be affected by with no funding from this New Starts program. And then the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Can you go back for a second?
Sure.
So, it initiates the privatization of the nation's air traffic control operations. I seem to recall that was sort of controversial a few years ago. Someone want to refresh me on that? I don't know.
Madam Chair, this goes back.
How do we know that that's what that is intended for? Was
Madam
that
Chair-
like directly called out in the budget?
Madam Chair, it has been called out in the budget. I think Congressman Schuster, who's chairman of the Transportation Committee over in the House, supports such an effort. And it all the way goes back to, I think, to the Reagan administration where they wanted to privatize. So this is not a new proposal. It is goes back at least 15, 20 years. And there seems to be some support, at least in the House and the president. Right?
Good afternoon, Lauren Olson, Government Relations Representative. It continues to be a controversial idea, actually. And there's been a lot of opposition, even from people involved with appropriations, about the idea of privatizing and a preference to kind of keep more control over those resources. So it still faces a lot of opposition for both sides of the aisle, but President Trump did express support for it recently, so it's on the table.
Thank you. So then my other question is, I'm more familiar with the Tiger and the New Starts grants because we have been recipients of those grants or applied for them in the Twin Cities for major projects. But what sort of transit would then be funded with the existing budget? Do we have any idea on that?
Madam Chair, some of the programs that are funded by the Federal Department of Transportation would be purchase for buses, equipment, rolling stock. There is some operating subsidy. Then there would be other things FTA does would be, or the Department of Transportation does, is some airport improvements and things of that nature. But it would be a pretty small, with the elimination of some programs from New Starts, it would be really contracting what the federal administration would like to do. But at the same time, the president has talked about a rather large infrastructure program where maybe transit would fit, but it's unclear.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Council President Johnson.
And perhaps, Mr. Brewer, I missed this, but Tiger grants are what?
This is a competitive program put out by the federal government a couple of years ago, and it's to fund multimodal transportation projects. So, for instance, something combining maybe freight transport with highway improvements. So both the commuter side of the equation would be addressed as well as the freight side of an equation. So looking for those types of projects.
Okay. Thank you.
Madam Chair, an example of a Tiger grant would be down by Target Field where we have the North Star and station and LRT and buses. They received some Tiger funding for that project.
So the Department of Housing and Urban Development, again, is our largest federal funder to the city. There are 4 entitlement funds that we get from the Department of HUD. And 2 of them are slated for elimination in the budget. That is a Community Development Block Grant Program and Home Investment Partnerships. Those total $12 million, roughly $12 million annually now to the city. It also proposes the elimination of the Choice Neighborhoods Program, which is a redevelopment source of funding for public housing agencies. Since the bulk of these immediate program eliminations here pretty much add up to the $4.3 billion you see on the screen there. So we don't expect at this point I don't expect too much of an immediate hit to our other grant funds we receive from HUD for homelessness assistance and housing for persons with AIDS. However, I would expect in future budgets the squeeze to be put on those programs because, as you may be aware, HUD has kind of in their base budget a level of funding for housing, public housing voucher assistance, and those costs increase over the years. There's more people that could get into that, and so to be able to fund that, fully fund that to the level that HUD wants to be able to do, it'd take the money from other programs of HUD. And so I would expect in the out years, unless there's to the general HUD budget an increase to it, I would expect in the out years some increasing pressure on those type of programs.
On what type of programs?
The homelessness assistance programs and the housing for persons with AIDS program dollars that we've received.
Okay.
Those are right now on the order of about $2 million to the city.
Yeah, and I'll just note, even though we have a legal separation from our public housing authority, we still have a strong relationship. We approve all the appointments, and just found out recently that we actually approved the executive director too. So a very strong, close relationship with public housing, and so our understanding of any impact on the public housing authority is also very important.
Yes, it will be a tight budget for the public housing division of HUD. Okay. Homeland Security. We receive Homeland Security funds. Mentioned the fire department. We also receive it for our emergency preparedness function in the city. The budget has called for a reduction of emergency preparedness funds by $667 million, and has also indicated that they would like to have those funds be matched with a 25% local cost share, which is currently not the case. So our emergency preparedness funds we would receive through formula would need to be matched 25% by the city. This is in line with other FEMA disaster assistance programming, but this would be new for emergency preparedness.
Do we know anything about the trend line on use of emergency preparedness funds? I mean, I don't know that I have, anecdotally, it seems like there are some increasing trends from natural disasters kind of around the country, those sorts of things. I could be totally wrong, but, just seeing that and kind of trying to think about what comes under that category, which primarily is a lot of natural disasters. I'm curious about the pressure and then kind of that cut impact.
Madam Chair, I will answer this way. I believe the disaster funding for natural disasters is outside of this budget. It's an extra appropriation outside of the budget. So it's a contingent.
So what does FEMA fund then?
Pardon?
What is this fund then?
This FEMA funding is for emergency preparedness planning and operations and exercises. So
that's essentially our ability to
Right.
respond to the
Correct.
natural disasters we were
Correct.
just discussing.
Yes.
Okay. Well, all right. So anyway, that does seem related to my point. And then I know you said that the fire department grants that we had received in the past, which again is more just for general personnel, came from this department. Was that any particular program? Homeland Security now is so big.
Correct.
That it's hard to think of all the things that used to be in other departments that are now part of Homeland Security. So,
Yeah, Madam Chair, I don't think I've seen any in the language anything regarding the things that we've taken advantage of for firefighter hiring grants. I would expect that would be under pressure though, because the philosophy in this entire budget is basically those that the local could be funding, they should be funding. And the federal support shouldn't be there. So I would expect a program such as the Assistance for Firefighters grant that we've taken advantage of in the past would be under threat of either severe reduction or elimination.
I think Mr. Ranieri might want to say something.
Madam Chair, we have also taken advantage of the equipment grant from the Homeland Security for the fire department. The chief has been able to replace a lot of equipment that maybe only has a 1 or 2 year shelf life. Other departments around the state have bought fire trucks, and I don't know if we bought any vehicles, but I know we bought a lot of equipment that needs to be replaced.
Thank you.
These are some other local implications to note. These are other programs. We just selected a few that can affect us locally. The city is currently working with the Economic Development Agency and the Department of Commerce to pull together an economic development strategy for our Promise Zone. Well, that office is proposed for elimination. The National Endowment for Arts is proposed for elimination. As mentioned earlier, that's supported several of our community partners in community artwork installations and programming. And we currently have an application. One of our partners, the West Bank Association I know of, has an application in front of them. And then the U.S. Interagency Council on Homelessness, which is a coordinating office at the federal government. And what it does is it weaves together all the various funding strands for homelessness that come out of the various federal agencies and tries to coordinate how they're used in local communities. And that's been a key program for addressing homelessness among veterans. And again, this office is proposed for elimination, and it would seem kind of to run contrary to other messages in the budget of kind of coordinating and getting federal agencies either out of the business or make them work better with local communities and giving local communities the tools they need to take up the federal piece. So,
Can I just go back for a second, because you didn't mention here in the cuts to the Environmental Protection Agency, but I thought there had been some analysis actually by maybe the Star Tribune, I'm trying to remember, because some of that, of course, goes to the state, and some of the state money that will be most affected, I thought, was for kind of water and then also air monitoring, which has a significant impact on some of the work that's